So it's a real pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Rachel Dodds, who many of you know for lots of great work that she's done, not only here in Canada, but globally on a number of different sustainable tourism initiatives. She's a very passionate change maker. She's worked in the tourism industry, helping all levels of government, businesses, and consumers make more responsible choices for the environment, communities, the economy over the past 25 years. She's a professor at Toronto Metropolitan University and also the director of Sustaining Tourism, which is a boutique consultancy. We put a link into her business as well. That's on the website if you want to have any further information on that. But let's jump into this, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Dodds.
Thank you so much. And please just call me Rachel. Doctor is so pretentious. I can't cope with that kind of thing. So I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you for inviting me. And I do see some familiar names, but I got a number of questions, and I know that we have a diverse group of people with lots of different questions. So I'll try and deal with the basics, and then we have a follow-up session, which is going to go into a bit more detail. So I really encourage you, if you have more questions, to reach out to GMIST and ask. And today, there's been a lot of conversations about the need for tourism to be more sustainable or regenerative or eco. There's so many terms. And we know that tourism reaches a lot of different things that are not tourism related, but it can also have a lot of impacts, good and bad, jobs, money, but amount of energy, conservation, local livelihoods, etc. So, one of you asked, what do you feel is the most important step in becoming a sustainable business? And this session is all about that. And really, it's about just start. So we're going to talk about the definitions, because I think it's very confusing at the moment. And then we're going to talk and hopefully I'll inspire you to have a few ideas. So what the heck, honestly, do all these terms mean? We have ecotourism, and we have sustainable tourism, and over-tourism, and regenerative tourism, and responsible tourism, and community-based tourism. And there's many more. And so I wanted to go through them just so that we had clarity. And especially since the pandemic, we've even had, a lot of conversations since about over-tourism and TIAC and Destination Canada. And now your provinces, probably as a small businesses, you're seeing more and more things being thrown at you. And it's not new. I was on the TIAC advisory board for sustainable tourism in 2007. And we had a climate change organization in 2008. But finally, I think maybe the governments are starting to recognize that this is really needed, and our wonderful resources and people are important. But as a business, it can be really tough. I have my own startup as well, just even where to start and what do all these things mean. So I'm very pleased that the governments are starting to take notice, but I also realize that as a business, we need a little bit of help just to understand where these things are going. So just as an overview, in 1992, the Rio Declaration talked about this. And 2 years ago, there was big news about the need to be carbon neutral and carbon positive with the Glasgow Tourism Declaration, which I'm sure many of you have had sign up. And it's lovely, but we need to move in a way that we can all have the same starting point. And that's what I wanted to start about today. So let's just go through a few definitions. So ecotourism is the one that started really in the 90s. And I'm going to give you definitions, and you can read them on your own time. And I don't like to read off slides, but ecotourism is a form of sustainable tourism. And it's a very niche scale. So it usually focuses on small scale. It usually focuses on natural areas. It usually has some form of education, and it involves local people. But it's extremely tiny. And so all forms of tourism can become more sustainable: cruise ships, massive hotels, all inclusives, but not all forms of tourism can become ecotourism. And so that's the difference. So if you're holding a hike in the middle of Gros Nord National Park, you could call that ecotourism, but you certainly couldn't call a cruise ship ecotourism. So that's the fundamental difference there. And interestingly, most of the developed world doesn't even use the term ecotourism anymore, partially because it's been overused so many times. And then we moved on to community-based tourism. And again, it's locally owned, but the difference is that it should be managed, or at least partially owned, but managed and controlled by the local community, so that the community gets a significant portion of the benefits. So a lot of times there are examples where someone could go into, again, Gros Morne, and it could be a tour operator working with a local community to bring tourists into that particular region. But if the tour operator is 100% in control, that's not community-based tourism. And so that's the difference, is the ownership of those kinds of things. And if anyone has questions, by all means, throw them into the chat, because I'm happy. I feel we've been webinared to death enough. I'm happy to have a conversation. And then we have responsible tourism, and this is a very long definition. But the key fundamental difference is that the industry, so businesses such as yourselves, got really tired of these terms and said, how does it apply to us? And so businesses can usually wrap their head around the need to be more responsible, in that they provide benefits for other people. They act more responsibly. I guess kind of like we tell our children, act responsibly, be polite, consider others, the 10 commandments, however you want to do it. So it's like sustainable tourism. It's just the word that businesses tend to use, and it's been adopted more by the industry as something they can wrap their head around. The issue is that a lot of times what people define as being more responsible for themselves are not necessarily how everyone else defines being responsible. But if you look in terms of improving working conditions or involving local people in decision-making or being culturally sensitive, a lot of these same phrases and terms come up in all these definitions. And then we have sustainable tourism. And this is probably the most widely used term, but it's also probably the most overused term. And as I said before, all forms of tourism can become more responsible, but you can never be 100% sustainable, because as soon as you set foot out your door, you have an impact. And so the question has been about aviation and flying. How can you say that your sustainable tourism, Newfoundland, for example, or Labrador is all about sustainable tourism when most people have to fly to get there? And therefore, it's in its very nature, it's not sustainable. But it's also the term people have said, I want a sustainable business model, or I want to have sustainable income. So the word sustainability has been kind of overused, but the fundamental elements of the balance between environmental, social, and economic is still there. And then we move to over-tourism, which was alive and well. This is a great picture of, this is actually in Croatia, a hike, eco-tourism hike, which has become an over-tourism disaster. And it's been really sensationalized by the media, maybe to the benefit of those people who are trying to do work in it. Myself sometimes is quite pleased that the government is taking notice, but it also has also been sensationalized. But fundamentally, the term over-tourism means is when there are too many people in a particular place that they can't handle. So it can happen in a city, it can happen on a mountaintop, it could happen in a town. But when the area is degraded, so either there's local resentment, it could be crowding, it could be environmental degradation, it could be local resident resentment, all those different things, but it is almost the perfect storm. And so we've been talking about these issues of what happens when too many visitors go to one place for a long time, but over-tourism really got coined in 2018 and really exploded. And one of the reasons it's used a lot is because it's getting cheaper and easier to travel. And now after the pandemic, more and more people want to travel. And so places are being overrun and they can't cope because they're not properly managed. So it's a management issue, but it's also a very media sensationalized word. So if that makes sense to everyone, if it doesn't, please jump in and say, I don't get it. And then we move to regenerative tourism, which is essentially what Destination Canada and a few other people have been talking about. And fundamentally, regenerative tourism, if you want it in an easy way, is saying we need to leave a place better than we found it. And a lot of times, it's not just about doing less damage, but it's about creating positive outcomes. So people have said that we need to move on from sustainable tourism to make sure that we have positive outcomes. And I would say that's totally fine. But it's about starting. And it's fundamentally that if you do sustainability right, you are being regenerative because it is about that balance. So just as an overview, we usually have the environmental impacts, we usually have the social impacts, and we usually have the economic impacts. And the sweet spot is when you're actually doing all of those well. But we need to think always that there's a political element in here on how easy it is to do or how difficult it is to do. And so there's historically been a lot of focus just on the environmental side. There is, again, with the climate crisis, but it's about really respecting that balance. And if we do it well, we should always be thinking of our impact as a business, our impact as a community, who are we benefiting, and at what cost. So sustainability should really consider all the elements, and then it will be regenerative because it's about that fundamental balance. So in my mind, and everyone has their different opinion, but it doesn't really matter what definition you want to use. The issue is just start. And you can call yourself whatever you'd like, but it's not about whether or not you're a regenerative business or a sustainable business. It's about whether you're doing something or not. And so that's the issue. Academics are extremely guilty. We love to come up with a new term every 5 minutes, but that's where human beings and their ego get involved. And I think that everyone who's on this call has joined for a particular reason, realizing that we need to make our communities and our natural environment and the places we live better. And that's the fundamental piece of this. So someone asked in the Excel sheet when we sent it out for questions, they asked, what are the incremental steps that can be undertaken? And so I'm going to go through a few. And there really are a lot of low-hanging fruit, and it's not just about spending money. So let's go through just a couple just to excite you. And this is just a little picture of someone who sent it to me of Newfoundland. So if any of you are there, I just thought you don't have to be alone in this process. You know, what's this picture is not showing are all the other beautiful puffins that are nearby. And that's the sense is that sometimes as a business owner, you just don't have time, number one. You don't have a lot of money. And so where do you just start? You're not just alone on the cliff. So some companies are doing amazing things. And the climate argument is you have to be perfect overnight. That would be a great goal to be aspiring to, but every journey begins with the first step. And so I wanted to share with you just a few ideas of different businesses locally and internationally that are doing some different things. But before I do, I think I had put up a little poll just so I had a little bit of an idea of where people are from. And maybe we could just run that through if possible. And Jonathan, I think that's up to you. There we go.
Sorry, was that the first one that you
Yeah,
want?
that's fine.
Do you want both of them to go?
Sure, that would be great. I only see one, but it would just be great to see if I gave you my 5-minute brief, if everyone understands what they all mean now.
I'll start the other one after this one. So this one's done.
Look at that. So there we go. Well, I think it's impressive already. You should congratulate yourself that none of you had no clue. So all of you have some idea, which is great. And you know, there are more, and don't get me wrong, there will be a few more before we finish this journey, but my guess is we'll never finish this journey because it's a journey, not a destination. And that's great. Oh, super. I love seeing that. So we have mostly small business operators and a lot of others. And I'm not sure what the others are, but if you'd like to share, please put them in the chat. And I'm not sure too how many of you are from Atlantic Canada or elsewhere. So if you wanted to share, you could just put it in the chat and say, you know, I'm sitting drinking an Aperol Spritz in Italy and I'll be jealous. Or you could say it's raining and, you know, I'm in British Columbia. So it's completely fine. And if you don't want to contribute, that's fine too. There we go. Oh, we've got a few Atlantic people. Lovely. Great. Okay. So we've got mainly Canadians, which is fantastic. Look at that. Oh, all the way to Vancouver Island. And it's very nice that it's sunny. Seems to be sunny everywhere, which is a novelty these days. So that's great. We've got a good bunch of people. 2 degrees in Ontario. I love it. Yes. Where is spring? That's what we're all saying right now. Where is it? So I wanted to inspire you, and I have some cross Canada examples as well. And welcome everyone. There's a lot of Newfoundland, and I was just in Newfoundland last summer, and so a lot of my pictures are coming from Newfoundland. And I have to say, I'd been there once in 1999, and I went last year, and I fell in love with it all over again. So for those of us who are really looking to get outside of our own country because COVID is, hopefully over, we have some amazing things in our own backyard, and maybe that's why we're here to talk to them about it today. So let's talk. So it's really, it's interesting. There's a number of different places, but there's a new accommodation in Grossmoor National Park in Newfoundland, which has recently put a lot of focus into sustainability. But, sometimes they're doing really, really simple things. They're sourcing local food from the area. And they're also sourcing, when they're going to their suppliers, they're sourcing recycled and eco-friendly products as much as possible. Because if anyone has been to Grossmoor, you know how far away it is from everywhere else. And sometimes you just don't have everything at your fingertips. So it's really hard to be perfect, but they're starting. And that's just an example of how they got there. Then we can move on to something like Fairwear in the United States. And these are lanyards. So if anyone's having a conference or you're hosting an event, they literally rent you their lanyards, and then they take them back so there's no waste. And so as a conference organizer, an event organizer, or going somewhere, instead of all that waste just by having the lanyard badge, you can just rent them and give them back. So really, really simple things. It's about starting. And interestingly, they worked with a company. They worked with Aspen Ski Company, again in the States, who wanted to do something. And they said, actually, why don't we recycle all our old ski instructor jackets into bags and then sell them, and all the money would then go to the company or for charity or for whatever source they need. And so they worked with them and said, what can we do? And Fairwear helped them move on this level. Really, really basic. But when you just think about it, every single year, there's a new ski uniform. There's a new jacket. And so what happens to all that waste? And sometimes it's just about thinking a little bit differently of things that we're not even conscious of how much we consume and how much we use, but making one effort a lot of times turns into a really good story. And it's the storytelling that everyone wants to hear. They don't want to hear, I'm the best, I'm doing this. And I feel that, especially in Canada, we hear the same examples over and over again. And sometimes we just want to hear something different about someone else who's done something. And then we have Mariposa Folk Festival. I wanted to throw in a festival. Because I wasn't sure what kinds of businesses everyone was, I wanted to give a variety. But this, I would really encourage you to look at folk festivals or the music festivals in Canada in general, from province to province, across the country and the territories, have done some amazing things. But for example, over 10 years ago, Mariposa tried to go down the single-use plastic, and they eliminated water bottles. And they actually counted. So they started with just trying to get people aware. And then over the years, they applied for grants, and they got a water truck, which Ontario sponsors. There's lots of grants to get water trucks. Other provinces are moving. Some of them have it, some of them don't. But after they did that, then they wanted to raise awareness on why it's so important. And so actually, this was my grad student who built this out of chicken wire, and we filled it with plastic bottles, and we had, every festival goers coming in at the front gate saying, how many water bottles are in here? And you can win a ticket for next year's festival, just to raise awareness of the fact that they had done something. Because sometimes you need to explain to people what it is. And this visual, which was, almost 9 feet tall, was a great, easy way to show people that you could do something different. And they've done a whole bunch of different things since then. But the water bottle example really, really stuck with people. And it was really interesting. I think people who go to folk festivals maybe are a little bit more sustainability minded anyways, but they actually got a lot of press out of it too. So something that they'd been doing, they just hadn't shared, but they shared it in a way that was just a bit more fun. And they didn't, have the time. And so they worked with a local university. It happened to be mine, which is why I know the story. But, my students got free accommodation and a free festival pass, and they were happy to do a bit of education in exchange for, 4 hours of a day of work for a free ticket. So it doesn't always have to cost you money. And then let's come back to Newfoundland for a bit. Grossmoor Adventures, just tour operator, they recently won the Newfoundland Sustainable Tourism Award because of their recognition to promote eco-friendly products and to try and preserve local cultural heritage. And it's their efforts. It wasn't their success that they won the award for. It was about their efforts. And, you know, I encourage you sometimes as a small operator, especially if you're a tour operator or a hotel or a restaurant, you can go and find what other people have done and replicate it. You don't need to figure it out all on your own. A lot of this information is out there. And in the next session, if you want specifics on, you know, how do you set up a carbon audit, or what does a sustainability strategy look like, or what is, you know, how do I do this? Those are the questions that you need to be asking GMIST so that they can tailor specific helpful webinars so that you can figure out the step-by-step rather than the generic. And so this is more generic, but by all means, please share. And someone just put in the chat, the bottle idea is fantastic. They worked for a tour company last year that gives out one reusable bottle to each guest, and they never used a single plastic bottle. That's great. And you know, interestingly, I now have loads of recyclable or reusable water bottles, and I say no, thank you. And I give them a lot of times. This same festival, Mariposa, they got a whole bunch of mugs from the local Salvation Army. And when people came in, if they didn't have their own reusable mug, they gave $10. And if they didn't bring the mug back, then they didn't get their $10 back. But if they gave the mug back, it was $10. But it certainly didn't cost us $10 for a mug. And we didn't have to create new swag from China to bring it in. We used existing materials, and people loved it. So yeah, there's some just creative ideas. And then if we go across the other side of the country, we've got Harbour House Hotel and Restaurant in BC. It's also a farm. And I recognize it's not always possible to own your own farm and a hotel, but they use their own farm for their organic supply in their restaurant. And a lot of times it's becoming very, very popular on Vancouver Island and elsewhere, is that the local farmers markets start to supply the hotels or the restaurants. And it's complicated because you don't always have enough product, and it's very seasonal, but it's about supporting their local agriculture. And this is happening in the Caribbean too. For example, I was talking to a hotel in the Turks and Caicos the other day, and they had said that they used to import almost all their fresh produce from Miami. And they used to throw away about 40% of it because by the time it got there on the plane, it had already wilted or it wasn't fresh. And so they started their own rooftop garden. And now they buy from local suppliers, and their food costs have gone way down. And they're promoting the fact that they don't always have everything on the menu because they're trying to source locally. And they said they haven't really got any complaints from guests because they're positioning in a way that they're trying. They're not perfect, but they're trying. And I think that's a real learning experience, that even some high-end hotels or experiences sometimes get away with things because they're vulnerable enough to say, we're not perfect. And that's a big thing right now with the whole greenwashing argument is, you know, if you say that you're doing something you're not, then you should be slated for it. But if you say you're trying and be vulnerable about that, that's sometimes what people want to hear. And somebody just put in the chat that they're doing this at their own inn. And they have their own farm, which is great, but they also supply their own beef and a lot of their own vegetables and herbs, which is amazing. And it's whether or not you're telling your guests about this, because the desire for local food or something different is becoming more and more. Not always. Everyone likes their McDonald's if that's the kind of person you are. But if you position it correctly, it can be an advantage as well. And it's not just about the environment. So this is a picture of the Magnus Hotel in Vienna. It's technically a social enterprise. And why are they a social enterprise? Because they're hiring refugees to work in their hotel. And as we know in Canada, we're getting more and more refugees, asylum seekers, etc., who are trying to make a start. On the plane the other day, I just watched the greatest movie about peace through chocolate. So those of you in Nova Scotia will know. And it was just such a heartwarming story. Not in the beginning, of course, but at the end, you know, everybody needs to have a livelihood and everybody needs to contribute. And Magnus Hotel has won a lot of awards through it. And they're, you know, they just knew they needed to do something. And it is complicated. There's a number of restaurants in Toronto that I know of that have hired disadvantaged youth, and they've had lots of problem keeping them, and they've had issues with behavioral things. But they scaled it down so that it became manageable for them. And that was something that they wanted to do. So it's not for the faint of heart, but it was a really great idea. And now I want to give you a few things of just tangibles before we go on, before some questions. And Marriott is a big, big chain. And this is in the Caribbean, of course. But people always say that to be more sustainable is really difficult and complicated, and it's expensive. It doesn't have to be, but we have to look at how we solve our problems differently. So for example, they decided to change their light bulbs. This was a while ago. And they changed all their light bulbs, and it cost them quite a bit. They had several solutions. So they had to change 320 light bulbs, but they also realized that once they changed all these light bulbs, they had to change PAR 38s to 18 watts and MR 16s to 6 watts and go through the lighting. But they realized that they had about an 84% savings in energy consumption. So it didn't just reduce their energy costs, it actually reduced their air conditioning costs in terms of the need to have doors open or not and natural light. They were really a little bit more strategic about it, but they also saved maintenance costs. So they realized even though they spent money in the beginning, they got a lot more savings back at the end of it. But, again, they spent $2,000 per room on energy every year is what they realized. So that's an average for a hotel. And an LED lamp or a fixture will last 50,000 hours. So that's more than 5 years at operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week before you have to change it. Whereas if you look at an incandescent light bulb, it only runs for about 2,000 hours, which is less than 2 months. And so when we need to start thinking about sustainability, we need to start shifting our focus on what is the immediate versus what is the long term, and can we afford to invest in something that's going to save us money in the long term? So it's not difficult to see why an LED alternative is much better than an incandescent. But sometimes when you're talking about big retrofits, yes, it can be really daunting. But sometimes, you got to figure out what's feasible for your property or for your business and budget it in, because you have your ROI every month, you have your operations costs. We do things, we pay our electricity bill every month without thinking about it. But if we started even just to track it, so I was working with a local inn, and I said, how much is your energy bill? They said, well, we don't know. I said, of course you do. You have your energy bills. So I said, just tell me what you used last year. Let's put in place a few incremental changes, and then let's see next year how much you saved. And it was amazing. They saved 15% by just doing some really small things. And so it doesn't have to be huge. We just have to start. And I wanted to show you another example. This again is on the other side of the country in Victoria. And they had a real struggle. And this is a story that I've actually just written into a case study, and it's actually free online on LinkedIn. You can download it for, I think, the next month for free, and it goes into much more detail. They were doing great things. They had a living wall inside. They were voted, some of the best places to work, but they also had a labor shortage, which I'm sure everyone can identify with. But this was 5 years ago. It's even worse now. They were paying $12.50 an hour, and they had an 89% turnover in staff. And the general manager realized it was costing $2,200 approximately to replace, to train, and to hire new people. So over a year, she calculated that it was $200,000 of their operating budget just for staff. And they're not a chain hotel, they're independent. She went to the investors and the owners, and she said, I would like to do something different. We're spending 5% of my marketing budget just on attracting new staff. And as you know, if you're an owner and you don't own your own property, if you're the manager, it's pretty hard to convince shareholders to spend money of any kind. And she went to them, and she could have lost her job over it. So kudos to her for trying. And she said, I want to give all my employees a 10% wage increase. And of course, the initial reaction was, no way. Look how much money this would cost us. So she drew out the numbers and actually proved that with a 10% wage increase, within 6 months, their turnover went down to 24%, from 89% to 24%, just by treating and giving people a better living wage, because in Victoria, it's one of the most expensive cities to live in. And her employees were commuting in 2 hours a day. And during COVID, she had to let a lot of them go. But after COVID, I've just talked to her recently, they all came, those who could, they came back, and she pays over the living wage. But here's the really great part of this. It took a lot of guts for her to go to her shareholders and say something. And she ended up, buying their trust and showing a cost saving, as well as winning a lot of rewards. And her ratings have gone through the roof. Her average daily rate has gone up. But here's the best part. Every other hotel in Victoria has now raised their rate. So all of a sudden, people working in hospitality, which is generally low paid with terrible hours and terrible pay and everything else, is now a better place and a better living wage for all of those people. And in return, it's also creating a better experience for the customer. So it's about creating value, truly. Whatever your value is for you, whether or not it's saving money or looking good or getting better reviews for your customers, or because you've been recycling for the last 20 years and you're fed up that no one has realized it's such a good idea, we just need to do a little bit more. And this is a picture of when I was in Portugal a few years ago, and I was with my daughter and she really wanted a souvenir. And I said, great, you can have a souvenir, but it has to be made in Portugal. And it was such an interesting experience for us. I think we had to go to 5 or 6 different, touristy shops before we could find tiles that were actually made in Portugal and not made in China. And just by the fact that we could find something that was made in Portugal made me buy something, because it was finally made in Portugal, because that was the value add that I wanted. I wanted a souvenir from Portugal, not from China. So whether or not it's for your business, for your customer, for your community, make sure you could just do small things. And it's sometimes more expensive to have locally made crafts, but it's interesting. People tend to value them a little bit more. Just a couple more examples, and then I'd really like to open it up for questions. In France, now we're going overseas, in Vanoise National Park, they realized that in their huts, and they're pretty close to being off the grid, people would constantly leave their lights on. And they just couldn't, they said, please turn the lights off. It saves electricity. Kind of like, please reuse your towels. It saves water. It just didn't work. And so they changed their communications and said, and for those of you who don't speak French, basically the summary is, you see the stars better at night when your lights are turned off. And so the value all of a sudden for the customer was, I get something out of this. I want to see the stars because I'm in a national park. And they all turned off their lights. And when they tracked it, they said they're, over 20% from the time they did this in their track period had turned off their lights, because they got a benefit out of it, rather than guilting someone into saying, you should turn off your lights. And so sometimes sustainability is about the messaging. What's in it for the customer? What's in it for you? If you're doing it for someone else, chances are you're probably not going to stick with it. It's kind of like quitting smoking. So this is one last focus. Again, I wanted to bring it back to local, is Cape Race in Newfoundland. And it's funny, when I found this example, and Grossmorn actually shared this, Nora from GMIST shared this with me, I thought, I know these guys. I knew them from years and years ago. But they're very focused on maintaining a sense of place. And so when you go on their adventures, they have their travelers stay at restored Indigenous homes. And it's one of their biggest unique selling points, which is why people go on their adventures, is because they want to experience the sense of place. So yes, so that's it. So there's one thing. It's okay to try, and it's okay to just start. GMIST is here to support you. So don't struggle in silence. There's lots of people who are in exactly the same boat. You may have been doing lots of stuff for a long time and you don't know what to do next, or you might have not even considered it as part of your business operations. And, do one thing. That's it. Do one thing and you'll feel good about yourself. Don't berate yourself for not having enough time, not having enough money, just being too busy, and you'll get to it next year. If you're a small business operator, that's exactly what you go through. So just pick one thing that's doable. And when you see the return, then you might do 2, etc. So what kinds of things could you do? You could, first of all, flip the switch. It's not about recycling. Less than 9% of recyclables get recycled in Canada. It's about reducing first. If you reduce, you will save money. If you reduce, you'll have less stuff, makes your life easier. Then reuse it, and then finally recycle it. You could do a benchmark, track how much energy, water, and electricity you use for the year, and then track it again next year and see what you could do to save it. But you have to measure it first before you manage it. You could get rid of easy things like water bottles. It's, this day and age, it's pretty easy. You could just say no more water bottles. I'm sorry, we're really making an effort. Please, no more water bottles. You could use more vegetables in your menu. You'll save money. It's much cheaper than meat alternatives. You just need to make it look attractive. Have 50% of your plate as vegetables instead of a quarter of your plate as being vegetables. Or make your plates smaller and you'll reduce 25% of your food waste, just like that. I mean, with some bits and pieces on the side, but you could shop or support your local farmers market, even for one thing. You could switch your suppliers to be a more sustainable choice. If it's too expensive, maybe that's not what you do. Maybe that's a cost you're willing to bear, but maybe that's something to share with your shareholders. If you're not even sure, you could just donate a percentage of your profits to a local community organization so that they see some benefit from you, and you'll probably improve your relations with them. Or, you might already be doing these things, and you could actually just share on your website what you're doing without bragging, but saying we're trying, and this is the first step we're doing. So again, coming back to the greenwash, sometimes you just need to share the story. And it's an interesting story. I was talking to a tour operator the other day, and they were trying to hire, and he said, this equity, diversity, inclusion thing is really tough. I'm trying to hire, but I'm a white male and I'm Jewish, and I have absolutely no idea how to do this. And instead of just posting on a bunch of sites, he actually put out on their blog and said, share with me how I can make this better, because we need to improve this journey. And the amount of response they got back and the amount of ideas, they then incorporated into their training. And their EDI has increased significantly, but it didn't increase significantly because they were amazing. It increased significantly because they admitted how vulnerable they were and they didn't really know what they were doing. And so they shared that story and asked for help. So that story became something really useful for them. You could measure your carbon emissions. It's not as complicated as people think, but it's a bigger conversation about whether or not you want to measure scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. What is scope 1, scope 2, scope 3? But it's something to do. Again, it's about measuring. You could educate your guests. Please bring your own water bottle. Please stay on the path when we go for a trek, because there's, that takes 100 years for this moss to regenerate. You could fly less. You could drive less. You could track it. And you could convince someone else to take the next step. So someone asked, how do I educate my clients about sustainable practices? And I would say, post it, share it. And someone noted in Newfoundland, the farmers market, that there is a culinary tourism programming and a zero waste kitchen demo programming and a zero waste festival. There's lots of things that are going on. And for example, even other tour operators, such as Much Better Adventures, they even share on their website how they measured their carbon footprint. So a lot of this information is out there. It's just you're busy and you don't have time to look. And so I would say, if you need more help, then go to GMIST and ask them. I also have a website and I post a lot of best practices, not many of these because I wanted to make it specific. But the next webinar that's on April 20th will provide practical, tangible things, but it's the things that you ask for that we'll go through. So I'd like to open it up for questions. I have talked far too much and I lost my voice for 2.5 weeks in early March, and I'm about to do it again. But I feel that many of you are from small businesses or from organizations and you have questions. So let's bring them on, and chatting is much better.
Feel free if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, go for it. It's not an unwieldy amount of people, so please do.
And it's always wonderful when people give you, compliments on chat. So bring those on too. My halo is getting bigger and bigger. Just kidding. And if you don't know what to ask, that's okay too. I think sometimes I was doing a talk and someone said I had absolutely no idea what to ask. That's okay too. So yes, if you want more practical examples or something specific, I'm sure I can come up with something off the top of my head. If you have a specific question and you don't want to share who you are, you can just send it to me and I'll just read out the question. So that's okay too. Or I maybe did such a great job, you're all like, oh my goodness, I need to go back and think of one thing. So go ahead.
How do you feel about, first off, awesome information. Thank you for all of that. Very well done. How do you feel about us asking more of our visitors? And, we've had lots of these conversations about expectations we have of them in our place. And I think you had a couple of really great examples there of we have this tendency to want to do everything for everyone because we want them to love us, right? And we want them to enjoy themselves. So I call it the over swag scenario, things like the water bottles that we talked about, but of positioning it, this is what you need to come prepared with, and prepared to do, and prepared to present yourself within our environment. And this, in exchange, this is what we will do for you. Is, I guess, what do you think of that scenario and sort of your read on that ask back to visitors?
Well, I think there's two elements of that. Number one, I think we as a tourism industry keep selling this perfect image of everything. So if you look at any brochure, people would have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning in the perfect light and the perfect temperature with no one around to get the shots that we put on our brochures or on our websites. And if we as visitors, I'm sure we've all done that, we wait for people to get out of our shot, or we take it from the ground, or we climb up on a building so that we can try and take a picture with no tourists in it, which isn't really representative of what we have. And so I feel like from the first angle, we as tourism marketers or as businesses, we need to be more honest about showing what we have. Yes, it's about a very pretty picture. And secondly, we can expect a lot of our visitors, but we have to educate them first. So for example, this picture right here is a picture of my cabin, which is where I go in the Gulf Islands, and it's completely off grid. But when my friends or visitors, sometimes people I've just met, come with me for a weekend, I very clearly set the expectations before they come. And I said, listen, this is the place where I don't have phones. We don't have electricity. We don't have running water. There's an outhouse. It's outside. It's still pretty nice. It's kind of like glamping. But that's my expectation, is that we go here to be friends and chat and drink wine, and we have no phones. And so if you want to have a phone and you want to check in once a day for emergency purposes, that's totally fine. But my rule is, if you want to come to my cabin, when you get on the boat, you switch off your phone, apart from that one check a day. But I don't want you sitting in my living room or around the campfire playing games on your phones. Kids aren't allowed anything. And everybody is like, oh, okay. But interestingly, at the end of a weekend or a week when they spend with me, they said, it was so nice to be able to switch off, but I'm glad you told me, right? So sometimes friends of my daughters will come and they'll say, don't worry, we'll just send an iPad with them. And I said, no, there's no iPads allowed. But I, as the owner of my cabin, have to set those expectations about what is acceptable. So just like, your kids come over and you say you cannot jump on the sofa, they still have a good time. They just don't jump on your sofa. But in destinations and tourism, we have this expectation that everybody already knows the rules. And we have lots of different cultures and lots of different ages and lots of different nationalities coming to our places with all different expectations. And so we need to set the expectation and say, we very clearly said to you, and remind them, right? We're all extremely slow and convenient. By the way, there's a webinar in 10 minutes. By the way, the webinar is starting now. By the way, please don't bring we only are using reusable water bottles. We're really trying to go plastic free. Please don't bring plastic because we won't allow it on the boat, or we won't allow it on our tours. Those kinds of things. I think we need to do it from a double-sided approach. Oh, and someone has a great a question. What about DMOs looking to start a sustainability journal? I found a lot of the examples out there are over the amount of control DMOs can have on various activities. That's a great question, because DMOs don't control, they can inform, but they don't have direct control over their stakeholders. I think an education piece is a key, right? Something that GMIST is doing. We all think that there's lots of information out there, but our own stakeholders in our own particular areas are overwhelmed. And sometimes, we only look at one of the 100 emails that come in. And I think it has to be geared locally. So that's something. I'm working with a lot of DMOs right now to try and even just to measure, to dashboard all the data that they get in and try and add in sustainability indicators so that they have some way to track that. And I think DMOs can be the leader example for small businesses. Here's what we're doing as a destination. Here's an opportunity to buy into it, or here's an opportunity to match, especially since DMOs are still controlling the marketing budgets, but the premise and the expectation is that they're going to become management organizations. A lot of times the small players can't, it's a pay-to-play model, and therefore the small businesses are left out of that equation, which is unfair because it's usually those small businesses that are providing those really unique examples that everybody uses in their marketing, and they've done it all on their own. And so we need to support not just the startups and not just the big businesses, but all those people in between and helping them out. Yeah, and someone just put measuring would also be helpful as a business owner. And I think one of the things we're trying to do with destinations is we're trying to provide the benchmarks for saying, here's how many people are coming and where they're going and how much they're spending. But we're trying to work with them now to say, what about if we, even asked on Google, did you know you can share your sustainability information? We're asking the stakeholders in a particular region to say, just go on and put it there. No one's going to judge you on that, but we're going to aggregate the information and we're going to benchmark it so that everyone can see what the norm is. And you can see whether you're below or above, on the right path. So those are things. But yes, I think education is a big thing. And I think sometimes just providing the audience of, the expectation is that everyone is going to sign up for this sustainable tourism pledge. That's great. But what is that actually going to do? I'd like to see, can we share the stories of what everyone could start? I worked for the International Business Leaders Forum, which is now the Sustainable Hospitality Alliance, a long time ago. And my job was to collect stories from the hotels and share them because they were too busy to do it themselves. And so we ran the campaign and got lots of media. And, this tiny hotel on some island said, wow, I never would have had the time or budget to do that. And it made us look good. It made them look good. So I think we can share resources sometimes.
Other questions or comments?
Oh, there's a very long one. How does one fight against over-tourism? Yes, big question. Second concert. 30,000 attendees at an area that's fully booked. I think one thing is that sometimes it does take the local residents or the local businesses to stand up and say, this is not cool. And I think we've been very silent as residents and small businesses for a long time, even with the cruise ships, for example, the festivals, we're not seeing any benefit. We don't want this. Politicians don't like to hear that. And that's been really useful in the fight against over-tourism is when people stand up because you are the ones who vote, right? Not the tourists. But I think a lot of times it's management. And I've worked with a lot of destinations who say, well, when we get to over-tourism, we'll deal with it then. And it's like building a hotel. You can't unbuild something. And that's a big thing. So I think sometimes it's, if you've got a lot of festivals in the area, sometimes it is saying, hey, listen, we all need to band together and say, like we can't do this. Or say, if you're going to have this festival, what measures are you going to put in place for crowding? Are you going to have public transport or increase public transit on this particular weekend? Because that's what we're expecting. Are you going to have people who are going to be measuring waste water, et cetera, and recycling and what have you? And push the governments to support those festivals, because usually festivals are run by 1 or 2 full-time people and volunteers. And a lot of times they don't have even the understanding of how to run a green team, let alone, valet parking for bikes or all these different things. But also sometimes it's about working with the festivals to say, listen, why don't you use the food from the farmer's market or give preferential treatment to those food trucks who are coming in, who are actually doing a better job or from the local area. So it's a complicated question. But you're right, those with deep pockets usually get the most, the squeaky wheel usually gets the most oil. But if you've got 10 small businesses saying, hey, hold on a second, we want this, pooling resources. But it is, I don't disagree. I just think that's a bigger question. But, showing the value sometimes, and I think that's where somebody from a DMO posted earlier, that's something a DMO can really say. We expect this to change and we're going to help on this level and this level. But yes, much bigger question and happy to have that conversation offline. Someone just said, what would be your suggested steps past the basics? Oh, and that's great. So whoever you are does a lot of the things already. the next step to sustainability. Well, that's what I think I would really like if you would send that question to GMIST about specifically what it is that you're thinking about. And then I can provide in the next webinar on April 20th, some of the different ideas. I mean, I'm not sure, have you done an actual benchmark? So that's probably a next step beyond the very simple things. Takes a bit of time. It's just working with a tour operator in Finland. And they said, we do a lot of stuff. And I said, well, what do you do? So I asked them a list of questions and then came back, and then we developed a strategy based on what they'd already done. And sometimes, it was measuring a carbon footprint, or it was increasing their guest education, or it was taking the next level. What kind of investment can you do to retrofit your inn? If you're a tour operator, retrofitting is a very different question. But are you training your staff? Are you training your customers? I'm sorry to hear about the petition was sent from residents and local businesses to be ignored. In Barcelona, they only actually got it really took effect with the local politicians is when they said, if it's tourist season, why can't we shoot them? And that hit the local media, and that's when the politicians really woke up. I'm not saying put up a sign like that by any means, but it is really tough as a small businesses to get business to look. But sometimes, sometimes getting the media involved is a useful thing. Media really likes to tell the story of the small guy right now, and politicians don't really like it when the small guy gets their voice heard. So that might be an option too. But I hope you find some traction. And festivals can be an amazing economic generator for the local community, but they can also have a lot of impact. So I completely understand where you're coming from. Do we have one last question before you all need probably your afternoon snooze or cup of coffee?
Oh, another praise for you.
Oh, it's always good to end on a praise. Thank you. But I'm happy to please, again, just as a final note, I know everyone burns out and an hour is the max. Please send your questions if you wanted to join the next one about something specific, even about how do you calculate a carbon footprint? What are the basics? Happy to tailor. And for those of you who put questions in, really appreciate sending the questions, and that's how it's tailored. So hopefully it was useful. And yes, good luck on the journal. And those of you who haven't started, just do one thing, feel better about it.
Thank you, everyone. We hope to see everyone hopefully on the next one, which is Thursday, April the 20th. If you haven't signed up, you can do that off of the GMIST site. And as Rachel said, if you have any comments or questions that you want to send our way, please do. You can do that at the info@gmist.ca. So thank you, and have a great day.
Take care, everyone. Good luck.